There is a particular kind of silence that precedes violence in a city. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of held breath. The kind that settles between buildings like a pressure system that has been building for days, for months, for years, pressing against glass windows and concrete walls until everything hums with a tension that most people feel in their chests before their minds can name it. Creston Heights had been humming for 10 days. Marcus Green had been 22 years old. He had been a son, a brother, a young man who worked double shifts at a shipping warehouse and spent his weekends coaching youth soccer at the community center on Briar Street. He had been walking home from the corner store at 9:15 in the evening, carrying a bag of groceries, when two officers from the Creston Heights Police Department stopped him for what their report would later describe as suspicious behavior consistent with known loitering patterns in the area. He had spoken to them. He had complied when asked to stop. He had not run. He had not reached for anything. 7 shots had been fired into his back as he turned to step away from the confrontation. He had died on the pavement 47 minutes later, before the ambulance arrived, his groceries scattered around him in the growing dark. Not a single officer had been placed on administrative leave, not one. The union had issued a statement within hours calling the shooting a justified response to a threatening situation. The police chief, a man named Raymond Bauer, who had held the position for 11 years and who owed his career entirely to the union's endorsement machine, had stood at a podium and told the city that the matter was under internal review. That had been 10 days ago. The internal review had produced nothing visible. The city had decided it was done waiting. The sound of chanting reached Diana Reeves before she pushed open the door of Meridian Roasters. She heard it through the plate glass, a rolling wave of voices that came from somewhere north and moved southward down the avenue like weather. She couldn't make out specific words yet. She didn't need to. She had spent 26 years inside the American legal system as a law clerk, as a public defender, as an assistant U.S. attorney. And for the last 11 years as a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit. And she knew the sound of a city that had reached the end of its patience. It was a sound that had a specific texture, low and building rhythmic in the way that only collective human voices could achieve when they had synchronized around something larger than any individual grievance. She stepped outside into the heat. The air hit her like a physical thing. It was the kind of June heat that made the pavement shimmer at its edges and gave every surface a quality of barely suppressed aggression. The asphalt of Oak Street radiated warmth upward from below, while the sun hammered downward from above, and in the narrow corridor between the buildings, the air had nowhere to go and simply accumulated heavy with exhaust and concrete and the faint chemical bite of distant crowd control equipment that had been deployed 3 blocks north the day before. The smell of it made her think of courtrooms in summer before the building's ancient air conditioning had been replaced that particular combination of anxious human bodies and institutional neutrality that she had learned to read the way other people read weather patterns. Diana adjusted the strap of her shoulder bag and turned left toward the parking structure on Meridian Way. She wore gray, a lightweight wool blazer over a charcoal blouse, dark slacks, sensible flats that she had put on that morning at 6:30 before her medical appointment. Her judicial credentials were in her bag as they always were when she was off duty, clipped to the interior pocket where they had lived for 11 years. There was no robe today, no law clerk walking 3 paces behind her, no court security officers positioned at the periphery of her awareness. There was only the street and the heat and the distant sound of voices rising and the cup of coffee she had ordered and not yet tasted going warm in her hand. She had not planned to be in this part of downtown at this hour. Her appointment at the Carver Medical Center had been at 9 and she had finished by 10:15, and when she had walked out into the morning sun she had felt for the first time in weeks like a person with unstructured time, which was a rarity so unusual in her life that she had stood on the sidewalk for a full 30 seconds not knowing what to do with it. She had walked, and walking had brought her here to Oak Street, to Meridian Roasters, to a cup of dark roast she had been meaning to finish and hadn't, and now to this particular stretch of sidewalk at this particular moment in time. She walked slowly, keeping to the building line, her eyes moving across the scene with the trained observation that 26 years in law had made involuntary. Her mind processed what it saw. The way it processed everything systematically, without panic filing observations into categories. The crowd was 3 blocks north, moving slowly. The mounted unit was still staging near the courthouse plaza. 2 news vans were parked on the east side of Oak Street with their satellite dishes extended. A young woman in a red jacket was live streaming from a corner building's second-floor fire escape phone aimed north face, concentrating. The street itself, at this particular corner, was clear. There were bystanders, shoppers, people moving along the storefronts, none of them protesters, just ordinary people navigating an ordinary morning that had become something less ordinary by the hour. She thought about Marcus Green's family. She had read the case file, not officially, not as a matter before her court, but as a citizen in the way that every black person she knew had read it, which was carefully and with the specific weight of recognition. She had a nephew who was 23 and built like a linebacker and loved jazz music and sometimes wore his hood up when it rained. And every time she thought about Marcus Green, she thought about her nephew. And every time she thought about her nephew in the context of what had happened to Marcus Green, she had to do the deliberate mental work of setting that thought down before it became something that interfered with her ability to function. She had set it down many times in the last 10 days. She was setting it down again now when she heard the horses. The Creston Heights Police Department's mounted unit had been in existence for 31 years, created during an administration that had believed visible shows of force were an effective deterrent to civil unrest. The unit had 6 horses and 8 officers in rotation, and it was deployed almost exclusively at large public events, stadium nights, holiday parades, and increasingly protests. Its effectiveness as a deterrent was a matter of genuine departmental dispute, though that dispute was never conducted publicly. What was beyond dispute was the psychological effect of a horse. A horse was large and warm and unpredictable in a way that a police cruiser was not. A horse breathed. A horse moved with something close to intelligence. A horse ridden by a uniformed officer above the crowd line communicated authority in a register that no vehicle could replicate. Officer Brett Dawson had been riding horses since he was 11 years old. He had joined the mounted unit 14 years ago and had never wanted to leave it. He was 38, broad across the shoulders, with the particular physical confidence of men who are accustomed to being the largest physical presence in most rooms. His record showed 3 Excellence in Service commendations, all awarded during the Holt administration, all based on documentation signed exclusively by Captain Gerald Holt. His record also showed 3 internal affairs complaints filed in 2019, 2021, and 2023 respectively, alleging excessive force during crowd control operations. All 3 had been dismissed at the supervisory review level. All 3 had been reviewed by Captain Holt. This morning, Dawson sat astride his horse ranger, a 17-hand bay with a reputation for calm dispositions and a tendency to mirror his rider's tension, and he watched the crowd from the northern end of the plaza with an expression that was not so much alert as satisfied. He liked these days. He had never said so aloud, not even to the officers he was closest to. But it was true, in the way that many truths about people are true, visible in behavior, if not in words. He liked the power dynamic of these mornings. He liked the way crowds moved when Ranger stepped toward them. He liked the feeling of looking down. Through his radio earpiece, Captain Gerald Holt's voice came through with the particular clipped authority of a man who was managing several things simultaneously. Dawson, move your unit south. Clear the Oak Street perimeter. Just the sidewalk access, I want the storefronts passable. Keep it professional. Copy that, Dawson said. He touched his heels to Ranger's sides, and the horse moved forward, and the 5 other mounted officers fell into formation behind him. From the northeast corner of the plaza, on the 2nd floor, fire escape of a building that housed a vintage record shop, 24-year-old Deja Brooks adjusted the angle of her phone and made sure the resolution was set to maximum. She had been live streaming for 22 minutes. The view count was currently at 47,000 and climbing, fed by shares from protest organizers who had learned to broadcast everything and trust algorithms with the truth. She had already captured 2 shoving incidents and 1 unlawful dispersal order images that were now being reviewed by the ACLU. She kept her lens moving, sweeping the perimeter, documenting the geography of the morning, the way her journalism professor had taught her, wide, then medium, then close. Tell the whole story. Don't just capture the moment. Capture what led to it. She tracked the mounted unit as it turned south, and she watched the unit's lead officer, the broad one on the bay horse, fix his attention on a woman in gray, walking alone along the storefront line, 50 feet from the nearest protester, clearly heading away from the crowd. Deja Brooks adjusted her angle and zoomed in. Something in her gut told her to keep filming. 40 feet south of Brooks's fire escape, outside a sandwich shop, Officer Jason Park stood in his patrol uniform and watched the mounted unit advance. He was 7 months on the force, this his 3rd crowd control assignment, and he had not yet acquired the particular professional numbness that made it possible to watch what he was watching without his jaw tightening. He had already noted the woman in gray. Noted that she was on the sidewalk, not the plaza. Noted that she was moving away from the crowd. Noted that she was carrying a coffee cup and a shoulder bag and nothing else. He saw Dawson angle Ranger toward her, and he felt something contract in his chest that he did not have the experience or the language to name, but that he would later describe simply as, "I knew it was wrong before it happened." He kept his face neutral. He kept his body still, and he made sure his body camera was running. Diana heard them before she fully registered them, the rhythmic clop of hooves on city stones, 6 beats, with a slight variation in each that her subconscious categorized as multiple animals, multiple riders, approaching from behind and to the left. She turned her head slightly without stopping. The mounted unit was advancing along the plaza edge, moving south, spread in a loose formation. She was on the sidewalk, building side, well clear of the plaza itself. She was by any reasonable definition not in anyone's way. She kept walking. "You, move." The voice came from above and from the left. She stopped and turned to face it. The officer on the bay horse was perhaps 15 feet away, having angled away from the unit's main line to position himself directly between her and her direction of travel. He was looking at her from under his helmet visor, with the particular expression she had learned over decades to recognize immediately, the expression of a man who had made a decision before gathering information, who had seen something that confirmed a pre-existing conclusion, and who was no longer in a mode that involved revising that conclusion. He was looking at her the way certain people looked at her. The way she had been looked at since she was 16 years old, in department stores, in taxis, in parking structures, in the lobby of her own building, by a new door attendant who had not yet learned who she was. She had recognized that look so many times that it no longer surprised her. What it did instead was engage a particular kind of calm, a going quiet that was not passivity, but something more like the careful, deliberate stillness of a person loading a weapon. "I'm on the sidewalk," she said. Her voice was clear measured. "I'm not part of the crowd. I'm walking to my car." The horse shifted sideways, a small movement that brought it 3 feet closer to her. The officer did not look away from her. "This is a restricted area. I won't say it again." Diana looked around deliberately, making the motion visible. She wanted him to see her doing it. To her left, the storefront of a vintage camera shop. To her right, the edge of the plaza, 30 feet away, occupied by protesters who were not moving in her direction. Directly behind her, the coffee shop she had just left. The sidewalk she stood on was by any observable measure not restricted. There were 2 other pedestrians within visible range, both moving in the same direction she had been moving, neither of them being addressed. "I see restricted barriers on the plaza perimeter," she said. "I'm not in the plaza. I'm on the public sidewalk. I'm leaving the area." She took 1 step forward. "I'm not being difficult. I'm simply observing that." She saw the baton come off his belt, and she felt before she could process it, the impact. It was not a tap. It was not a warning stroke. It was a practiced full-arc swing that connected with the junction of her shoulder and neck with a force that sent a bolt of white shock down her right arm and knocked her backward a full step, her body's immediate and involuntary response to the physics of impact. The coffee cup left her hand and hit the sidewalk. Her shoulder bag swung hard. Her right hand went numb from the fingertips to the elbow. She stood for 1 second in pure disbelief. Not fear, not pain yet. Pain would come in a few moments when the adrenaline metabolized. What she felt in that first second, standing on a public sidewalk in broad daylight, was the specific and clarifying disbelief of a person who has spent their entire adult life working within a system of rules, who has dedicated themselves to the architecture of law, who has believed, not naively, but professionally, operationally, that rules constrain even those who enforce them, and who has just received evidence delivered via baton to the shoulder that this belief has limits. "Are you serious?" she said. From the fire escape, Deja Brooks whispered something under her breath and kept filming. The officer urged his horse forward without responding. Ranger was well-trained and obedient, and he responded to the pressure of his rider's heels with the compliance of a large and powerful animal that does what it is told. His shoulder connected with Diana at chest height as she tried to step aside, and the impact was not violent, but it was not gentle either. It was the simple, overwhelming physics of 1,500 pounds meeting 140. And the result was that Diana went down onto the sidewalk, her palms scraping concrete, her right knee hitting the stone with a jolt that she would feel for 2 weeks, her head jerking sideways from the force of landing. She heard the crowd. She heard it the way she heard everything in that moment, with the heightened, almost clinical awareness of extreme adrenaline, where sounds become separately audible in a way they usually aren't, where you can distinguish individual voices in a mass reaction. She heard a woman scream. She heard a man shout something she couldn't make out. She heard the digital click and whir of cameras and phones, plural and sudden, like an audience in a theater when the lights go out and everyone reaches for their program. She heard the horses around her multiple sets of hooves as the rest of the unit converged. She pressed her left palm flat to the concrete and pushed herself up to one knee. Her right shoulder was screaming now, the adrenaline fading enough for the pain to announce itself, a deep throbbing burn that radiated from the point of impact outward like water spreading from a dropped stone. She looked up. 2 officers had dismounted. A third was still mounted, radio up, calling something in. A fourth was moving toward her from the right hand, already reaching. "I am a federal judge," she said. Clear, direct. The same voice she used in her courtroom when an attorney was speaking over someone else. "My name is Diana Reeves. I am a sitting judge of the United States Court of Appeals. My credentials are in my bag. Please check my bag." The officer who had dismounted on her left did not check her bag. He grabbed her left arm. "I am a federal judge," she said again. "Ma'am, you're being detained for obstruction and resisting." "I was struck with a baton while walking on a public sidewalk and knocked down by a horse," she said. She was not shouting. She had made the choice before the words left her mouth to not shout, not because she was afraid, but because she understood evidence. She understood that what was being recorded mattered. She understood that her composure documented would be useful in a way that her anger, however justified, would not. "I have not resisted. I have identified myself 4 times. I am asking you to verify my credentials before you proceed." The second officer cuffed her. He pulled her arms behind her back with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and the angle at which he torqued her right arm already injured the shoulder. Singing with pain made her vision flicker at the edges for a moment. The cuff clicked into place. She breathed through it. In, out, slow. "I am a federal judge," she said a third time to the officer on her right, who was reaching for her bag. He pulled the bag away from her shoulder. He looked through it, not carefully, but quickly, the way you look through something when you've already decided what you will and won't find. He set it on the hood of a police cruiser that had pulled up while she was on the ground, and he did not open the interior pocket where her credentials lived. From the northeast corner, Deja Brooks zoomed in to maximum focal length. The scene was clear. A black woman in business attire cuffed on her knees on a city sidewalk, surrounded by 6 officers, her shoulder bag on a car hood 20 feet away. The timestamp in the corner of her live stream read 11:54 a.m. The view count had crossed 120,000. In the crowd along the plaza edge, a man had begun shouting something that started as incoherent and sharpened as he repeated it into words. "She told them who she is. They heard her. They don't care. They don't care." Diana Reeves heard him. She noted the sound of it, the desperation in a stranger's voice on her behalf, and filed it away in the part of her mind that was already despite everything building the case. She was helped roughly to her feet. She did not fight it. She stood straight because she was a person who stood straight because 26 years of courtrooms had made this involuntary. She looked at the officer who had struck her with the baton. He was still on his horse. He had not dismounted. He was looking down at her with an expression that she would describe later in a sworn statement as indifferent. "You will regret this," she said to him. Not as a threat, as a statement of fact delivered in the tone she used when she had reviewed all the evidence and reached a verdict. Then she was turned around and walked to the vehicle. The processing room at Precinct 7 smelled the way all such rooms smelled, an accumulated history of institutional use coffee that had been warming for too long, and a cleaning agent that had never quite managed to cover what it was meant to cover. The fluorescent lights above the processing desk were the specific flat white of institutional spaces everywhere, the kind that make everyone look simultaneously overexposed and drained of color. The chairs were orange plastic, the hard municipal kind that have been uncomfortable by design in every police station and motor vehicle office in America for 60 years, as if discomfort were a policy instrument. A radio on the desk transmitted dispatch calls in the continuous, uninflected monotone of a system that processes events without emotional register. Diana sat in one of the orange chairs with her back straight. Her wrists were uncuffed when she arrived, a small and probably inadvertent mercy from the transport officer who had looked at her during the ride and said nothing but had loosened the cuffs before the vehicle stopped. Her right wrist was already showing bruising, and the shoulder where the baton had connected had progressed from burning to a deep, steady ache that she managed by not moving it, and by breathing in the deliberate rhythm she had learned from a meditation practice she had started at 47 and abandoned at 51 and then quietly resumed last year. The intake officer was a young woman named Kim Torres. She had been on the force for 4 years, assigned to Precinct 7 for 2. And she had the particular quality of someone who was very good at their job, and who was also very aware that their job sometimes required them to process events whose implications they were not able to fully address within their current institutional position. She had seen Diana Reeves's arrest on a colleague's phone before Diana had arrived at the precinct. She had seen the number, 160,000 views already and climbing. "Name," Torres said. "Diana Reeves. I'd like to state for the record that I have identified myself as a federal judicial officer on 4 separate occasions and that my credentials, which are in my shoulder bag, have not been verified," Torres wrote. Her face gave away nothing, but her writing hand paused for just a moment before continuing. "I'd like to call someone. That'll be after processing. I have a right to a phone call." "After processing, ma'am." Torres met her eyes. Something passed between them. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. A woman recognizing another woman's particular kind of calm in a situation that did not warrant calm. A knowledge transferred in a single glance. Diana waited. The processing took 23 minutes, during which Diana said nothing further except to confirm her date of birth and address. She watched Torres work with the specific attention she applied to everything, noting the time, noting each step, building the timeline that her mind was constructing with the involuntary precision of 11 years of judicial process. The charges being entered were obstruction of law enforcement, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. She noted this. She noted the officer of record Dawson B. Badge, number 4471. She noted that her shoulder bag had been inventoried and tagged without the interior pocket being opened. After processing, she was moved to a holding area. Not a cell, a room, which was a meaningless distinction at 12:11 p.m. on a Tuesday in June when you were a federal judge sitting on a hard chair with a baton injury and unchecked credentials and no phone. She sat straight. She waited. 22 minutes after she was moved to the holding area, Torres appeared at the door with a different expression, a tightening around the eyes that Diana read immediately as the expression of someone who has received new information and is recalibrating what it means for their own position. "There's been a request to speak with your supervising officer about your, Torres stopped, started again. "The captain would like to speak with you." "I'd like to make my phone call first." Torres looked at her. "I'll see what I can do." She had told them 4 times. 4 clear composed statements of identity. And she had been cuffed anyway. Think about that for a moment. What would you have done if you were in her position? Would you have fought back, or would you have done what she did, stayed quiet, stayed sharp, and started building the case? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story is hitting close to home for you right now, hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. 40 minutes after Diana Reeves was placed in the holding room at Precinct 7, Captain Gerald Holt appeared in the doorway. He was 61 years old, built like a former athlete who had shifted categories from athlete to administrator 2 decades ago and made peace with the transition. He had heavy features and the particular coloring of someone who spent a lot of time indoors under fluorescent light, and he carried himself with the authority of a man who had been a captain for 9 years and who believed, not unreasonably given his experience, that he had managed his way out of every situation that had ever required managing. He looked at Diana in her plastic chair. He looked at the intake form in his hand. He looked back at Diana. "Ms. Reeves," he said. "Judge Reeves," she said. Not aggressively, simply correctly. He paused. "I understand there's been some... Captain, I have been struck with a baton knocked to the ground by a horse cuffed with my injured arm, torqued at an unsafe angle, transported to this facility, processed on charges that have no basis, and denied a phone call for 40 minutes. I have identified myself as a federal judicial officer 4 times. My credentials remain unverified in my bag, which is currently in your property room. I would like my phone call. I would like my credentials verified. And then I would like to speak with your supervising officer." Holt was silent for a moment. His face did not change expression, which Diana noted as a specific kind of tell the stillness of a man who is calculating rather than responding. Our officers were clearing the plaza perimeter under an authorized dispersal order. "I was not in the plaza. I was on the public sidewalk. Officers on the scene have described your behavior as..." "I know what your officers have described," Diana said. "I am asking you to look at the evidence in my bag." Another silence. Holt was doing the thing that people did when they were processing information that conflicted with decisions they had already made, the slight squint, the almost imperceptible reorientation of weight from one foot to the other. "I'll have someone look into it," he said. "I'd like my phone call," she said. "Now." He left. She waited 12 more minutes. Then Torres appeared with a cordless phone and an expression that had added a new quality to its tightness. Something that looked, if you were trained to read faces in the way that 11 years on the federal bench trains, you like a person who has just made an irreversible decision and is at peace with it. Diana dialed from memory. The phone rang twice. "Webb," said the voice on the other end. "Marcus," she said. "I'm at Precinct 7. I was assaulted during the Creston Avenue protest and arrested. I need you here." A silence of approximately 2 seconds. "I'm already watching the live stream," he said. "I'm 10 minutes away. Don't say anything else." At 12:17 p.m., Deja Brooks's live stream had 430,000 simultaneous viewers. By December 31st, it had exceeded 800,000. The clip that was spreading fastest, extracted by a Twitter user in Chicago who had been watching the stream and had saved a 6-minute segment, showed a black woman in a gray business blazer telling a mounted officer clearly and composedly, "I am a federal judge. My name is Diana Reeves. My credentials are in my bag. Please check my bag." The clip showed this statement. It showed the officer's response, which was to continue directing his horse forward. It showed Diana going to the ground. It showed the cuffing. It showed her being helped upright and walked to a vehicle. Her posture straight, her face set, refusing by sheer act of will to give them anything else. The clip had no narration. It did not need any. Within 30 minutes of beginning its spread across social platforms, it had been seen by, among others, the Deputy Chief of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, a senior partner at the law firm where Diana had clerked 26 years ago, the editor of the legal journal where Diana had published her most cited paper, 11 of her colleagues on the 7th Circuit bench, and a retired federal judge in Georgia who knew Diana personally and who made a single phone call to the FBI field office in the city at 12:26 p.m. She did not identify herself as a retired federal judge on that call. She identified herself as a citizen who had just watched a currently serving federal appellate judge be beaten and arrested at a public protest, and who was calling to make sure the appropriate law enforcement entity was aware of what had happened. The FBI duty officer who took the call was already aware. The field office had received 7 calls in the previous 11 minutes. At the Creston Heights Police Department headquarters, 3 blocks from Precinct 7, the deputy commissioner's phone had been ringing continuously since 12:15. His assistant had stopped trying to screen calls and had started writing down names, institutions, and callback numbers in a list that was already a full page long and growing. The deputy commissioner himself was standing at his window, looking at the street below where a second group of protesters had begun to gather outside police headquarters, specifically their signs referencing not just Marcus Green now, but a second name, Diana Reeves. He had not yet called Captain Holt. He was working up to it. In the comment section of Deja Brooks's live stream, which had been running continuously since 11:32 that morning, the messages arrived in a flood that the platform's systems were visibly struggling to process, the count ticking upward in increments of thousands every few seconds. Some were outrage, some were grief, some were the specific kind of comment that appears when a story of injustice goes large enough to reach people who process such stories through a lens of pure fascination at the mechanics of power. People trying to calculate what happens next, what the legal exposure is, what the institutional response will look like. And some were simply people saying, I have seen this before. I have been in this position. I know what this feels like. She was so calm. I don't know how she was so calm. In the northeast corner of the plaza, Deja Brooks had come down from the fire escape. She was sitting on the front step of the record shop, her phone still running, her other hand holding a water bottle, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. She was 24 years old and in the second year of her master's in journalism, and she had been at the protest that morning. Because her thesis was about the intersection of citizen documentation and formal accountability mechanisms, and she had just accidentally produced the central exhibit of her argument, she would later say that the moment she watched Diana Reeves walk upright to the police vehicle, cuffed but composed, was the moment she understood what her thesis was actually about. Not documentation, not accountability. Dignity operating without flinching inside the machine. Special Agent Marcus Webb of the FBI's Civil Rights Division had been watching Deja Brooks's stream since 12:03 when it had been shared into a group text by a mutual colleague who had simply written the address of the stream and 3 words, "Is that Diana?" He had watched 20 seconds and confirmed that it was. He had been pulling on his jacket and reaching for his keys when his phone rang and Diana's voice came through clear and measured and giving him only the essential information, and he had said what he'd said 10 minutes, "Don't say anything," and ended the call and been out of his apartment in 90 seconds. Marcus Webb was 39 years old. He had graduated from Howard University School of Law 14 years ago and had clerked for 2 years at the United States Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit, where his judge had been a then relatively new appointee named Diana Reeves. He had spent those 2 years watching her work, watching the precision of her legal reasoning, watching the way she managed attorneys who underestimated her, watching the patience with which she separated the substance of arguments from the performances of those making them. He had learned more in those 2 years than in any other period of his professional life, and he had gone from her chambers into the FBI's Civil Rights Division with a clarity of purpose that he credited entirely to those 24 months of watching the way the law, when practiced with genuine dedication to its own principles, could be something worth fighting for. He had not clerked for Diana Reeves without also learning what it looked like when the law was practiced without those principles. He drove. The FBI field office vehicles were not marked, but Marcus chose not to take a field vehicle. He drove his own car. He had 2 agents with him. Torres, no relation to the officer at the precinct, and Calloway, both in plainclothes, both who had been briefed in the 3-minute drive on what he needed them to do when they arrived. Marcus had his badge on his belt and a copy of Diana's bio pulled from the court's public website loaded on his phone. He did not think he would need the bio. He did not think once he was inside Precinct 7 that there would be any genuine dispute about who Diana Reeves was. What he needed was not evidence of identity. What he needed was witnesses to what happened when he walked in. He parallel parked on the street outside Precinct 7 at 12:47 p.m. He noted the news van that was already stationed half a block north. The presence of a news van meant that someone inside the building had or would soon become aware of the level of attention this was attracting. He noted the small cluster of people on the opposite sidewalk who had their phones up. He buttoned his jacket, felt the weight of his badge on his hip, and walked toward the entrance. He paused at the door for a moment. He thought about Diana sitting somewhere inside that building with a baton injury and a cuffed wrist and a composure that he knew cost her something. Because composure always costs something, and because he had watched her maintain it for 2 years in circumstances that would have stripped it from lesser people. He pushed open the door. At 12:35 p.m., 12 minutes before Marcus Webb arrived at Precinct 7, Captain Gerald Holt had gathered 4 people in the small conference room adjacent to his office. Officer Brett Dawson, officers Ray Paulson and Nick Ferraro, who had conducted the arrest, and the precinct's union representative, a ruddy-faced man named Ed Kinsella, who chewed gum constantly and who had been union rep for Precinct 7 for 8 years. The door was closed. Holt stood at the head of the table. He had reviewed the situation with the particular calibration of a man who had navigated similar situations 3 times before and who had, in his assessment, come through all of them on the right side of the outcome. He had a process. The process was not complicated. Establish the narrative early, get everyone on the same page before any formal statements were taken, and rely on the institutional inertia of a system that, when given 2 competing accounts of an event, generally preferred the account provided by the people who worked within it. Here's what happened, Holt said. He didn't look at the file. He had already decided what had happened. The subject was in a restricted perimeter zone during an active crowd dispersal operation. She was given a lawful order to move and failed to comply after multiple warnings. Officer Dawson employed minimal necessary force consistent with crowd control protocols, and the subject subsequently fell while officers were attempting to establish a safe perimeter. She became verbally combative during processing and made claims about her identity that were not verifiable at the scene. He paused. The baton contact was incidental, minimal, within policy. Dawson nodded. He had the look of a man who had sat through this particular kind of briefing before and who knew his part. He was not concerned. He had never been formally disciplined in 14 years, and 3 internal affairs complaints had produced nothing. He had every reason to believe that his record would hold. The video is a problem, Kinsella said, still chewing. He had seen bad videos before, the kind that cost officers their jobs, cost captains their pensions, cost unions their political capital. This one had a specific quality he recognized and did not like: clarity. No ambiguity of angle, no question of distance. Just a woman in a blazer telling a cop who she was. "You see her face when she's cuffed," he said. "Stone cold, doesn't break. That's gonna play." The video shows an officer responding to a non-compliant subject during an authorized dispersal operation, Holt said. Context matters. Context doesn't trend, Kinsella said. 800,000 views does. And tomorrow it'll have 3 million and be replaced by the next thing. These things burn hot and burn fast. What we need is a consistent record and a consistent account. What Holt did not know at this moment was that Officer Kim Torres had returned to her workstation after bringing Diana her phone and had sat for approximately 90 seconds doing nothing, and then had quietly removed a USB drive from the locked drawer in her desk, copied the entirety of Diana's intake file and processing log onto it, and placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket. She had not decided in advance to do this. The decision had been made, she would later say, in the 90 seconds of sitting and doing nothing, made in the space between what she had seen and what she was being asked to process, as though she had not seen it. She was 28 years old and had been a police officer for 4 years, and she had not joined the police force to process federal judges like suspects, and that, as she would explain, it was the entire decision. What Holt also did not know was that the body camera worn by Officer Jason Park, a 26-year-old who had been on the force for 7 months and was on his 3rd assignment to a crowd control operation, had not been shut off during the arrest. This was technically a violation of the unit's informal protocol for situations that were likely to generate formal review, a protocol that existed nowhere in writing, which was precisely the point. Jason Park had not been fully briefed on this informal protocol. He was new. His camera had recorded audio and video from the moment the mounted unit began its approach. The audio quality was good. It clearly captured a woman's voice saying 4 separate times with escalating clarity, "I am a federal judge. My name is Diana Reeves. Check my bag." And it captured each time the absence of any response from the officers present that acknowledged this statement. Jason Park was sitting at his locker in the patrol room when the news van appeared outside. He pulled out his phone and looked at the live stream that 3 of his colleagues had been watching on their phones since noon. He watched for 30 seconds. He put his phone away. He sat very still for a moment. Then he went to find Officer Torres. The desk area of Precinct 7 went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has entered them that recalibrates the social physics of the space. Marcus Webb walked to the front desk. He placed his FBI badge on the counter, face up the eagle, visible the words Federal Bureau of Investigation in the embossed circle around the seal. He set it down with a specific quality of care that communicated everything about his intention. "Special Agent Marcus Webb," he said. "FBI Civil Rights Division. I'm here for Diana Reeves." The desk sergeant, not Torres. A different officer, a man in his 40s named Sergeant Hagan, looked at the badge. He looked at Webb. He looked at the 2 agents flanking Webb. He looked back at the badge. She's being released," Marcus said. "Now, sir, I'm going to need to contact the supervisor on—" "You can contact whoever you need to contact," Marcus said. "While you're doing that, I need to see her. I also need to see the intake log, the evidence property log, the arresting officer's report, and the body camera footage from all officers present at the scene of the arrest." Sergeant Hagan picked up his desk phone. The 2 officers who had been processing paperwork at the adjacent station had stopped processing paperwork. The officer by the coffee machine had set down his cup. A young woman in civilian clothes who had been waiting near the far wall was watching with her phone down, but her expression up, recording the scene with her eyes rather than her camera, in the understanding that sometimes you needed to actually see something rather than just document it. From the hallway to the right, a voice said, "What's going on out here?" Captain Gerald Holt appeared in the doorway of the hall leading to his office. He was holding his own phone. His expression was already the expression of a man who had received several pieces of bad news in quick succession and was working on integrating them. He looked at Marcus Webb. He looked at the FBI badge on the counter. He looked at the 2 agents. He did not look at the people behind him who had filed out of the conference room, Dawson, Paulson, Ferraro, and Kinsella, who had followed the sound of voices and were now clustered in the hallway entrance. Dawson was in the back. From this angle, he could not see the badge clearly. He could see Webb's face. "This is a departmental matter," Holt said. His voice had the quality of a man trying to maintain a position he was already aware he was losing. "Officer conduct during crowd control operations is—" "Captain." Marcus Webb's voice was steady, unhurried, and in no register compatible with negotiation. A sitting federal appellate judge was struck with a baton, knocked down by a horse, handcuffed with an injured arm, transported to this facility, booked on charges with no legal basis, and denied her right to a phone call for over an hour. She identified herself as a federal judicial officer 4 times. Those statements were documented by multiple bystanders on video with audio and are currently being viewed by approximately 1.2 million people. He paused. "I suggest you get your union counsel on the phone. And I suggest you do it before I start formally requesting those body cameras." Holt said nothing. The room said nothing. In the hallway behind Holt, Brett Dawson stood and understood for the first time in a professional career built on being large and on horseback, and on a system that had always absorbed the consequence of his choices and redistributed it to people who couldn't absorb it, that something was different about today. He could not have articulated what exactly was different. He just felt it. In the way that the temperature in a room changes when a storm has arrived. The architecture of how a video spreads is not random, though it can appear to be. Certain videos spread because they are extraordinary captured moments of natural wonder, or human achievement, or pure absurdity that travel on the fuel of uncomplicated delight. Other videos spread because they are terrible accidents, disasters, violence. The kind of images that the human visual cortex processes as threat, and that the social sharing instinct then redistributes through a network in the same way that a warning call spreads through a flock of birds, involuntary rapid total. Deja Brooks' clip spread on a different kind of fuel. It spread on recognition. Every person who watched the clip and shared it did so in the moment of recognition. The moment when what was on the screen connected to something they had stored in the file in their memory, that they kept not by choice but by necessity. The file of incidents documented and undocumented in which the system had looked at a black person and made a decision before gathering information. Every person who shared it was saying without words, "I know this. I have seen this. Here is the proof that I am not wrong about what I know." This is the particular valence of certain viral videos. They do not just document events, they document the gap between what institutions say they are and what they demonstrably are, and they do so at a scale and with a clarity that closes the argument that this gap does not exist, or that it is exaggerated, or that the people who have experienced it are mistaken about their own experience. The gap becomes undeniable in the way that only evidence can make things undeniable. By 2:15 p.m., the clip had been viewed by elected officials in 6 states. By 3:30, it had been placed before 2 Senate staffers who were working on federal police accountability legislation. By 4 o'clock, the legal director of the ACLU had watched it on her phone in a taxi in Washington and had forwarded it to the organization's litigation team with a 3-word message: "We need this." Diana Reeves, sitting in the holding room at Precinct 7, did not know any of this yet. She sat straight in her plastic chair, and she waited for her phone call, and she built from memory the timeline she would need when the call came. She was not thinking about viral videos, or Senate staffers, or the ACLU. She was thinking about the exact angle of the baton strike, and the exact duration of the phone call delay, and the exact words she had used all 4 times she had identified herself, because those were the facts, and facts in her experience of 26 years were the thing. Diana Reeves walked out of the holding area at 1:02 p.m. She walked the way she always walked, with the posture that 26 years in law and 11 on the bench had made as involuntary as breathing, a quality of vertical alignment that communicated neither arrogance nor performance, but simply the habit of a person who was accustomed to commanding rooms. Her right shoulder ached with every step in a way that she was managing by holding her arms slightly away from her body. A small accommodation that she refused to make larger. Her right wrist had been bandaged by Torres, who had appeared in the holding room 20 minutes after the phone call with a first aid kit, a glass of water, and the expression of a person who had made their decision and was ready to live with it. The bandage was white against her dark skin. She had noted with professional precision that the bruising was consistent with abrupt flexion injury from restraint applied at unsafe tension. She had filed this fact in the same place she was filing everything. She entered the main area of the precinct. Marcus Webb was standing at the front desk. He looked at her for a moment, a look that communicated everything that did not need to be said, and then nodded once. His 2 agents flanked him. Sergeant Hagan was at his phone. Torres had appeared from a side door and was standing near the property window with something in her hands. A brown paper bag, Diana's shoulder bag inside it, waiting. Diana's eyes moved through the room with the sweep she always made entering a new space. She catalogued it, the desk, the officers who had stopped what they were doing, the news van visible through the front glass, the young officer in the hallway doorway. Park, she would later learn, who was standing very still with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to announce it. And then she saw Dawson. He was in the hallway. He had moved forward, perhaps involuntarily, in the way that people sometimes move toward the thing they cannot look away from. And he was standing 15 feet away from her, in his uniform, with his helmet off and his baton back on his belt, and a report form in his right hand, a pen in his left, and the expression of a man who has spent the last 45 minutes writing himself a version of events that he believed was sufficient. Diana Reeves walked toward him. She stopped in front of him at a distance that was professional and not aggressive, perhaps 4 feet. She looked at him the way she looked at things she needed to understand completely, which was without emotion and without hurry. She opened her shoulder bag, which Torres had returned to her. She reached past the water bottle, past the folder of notes from her medical appointment, to the interior zipper pocket that no one had opened since her arrest. She withdrew her credentials wallet. It was slim, government-issue leather, dark blue, with the gold seal of the United States Courts embossed on the front cover. She opened it. The federal judicial identification card was backed by a holographic watermark that shifted between the words United States Courts and a pattern of interlocking scales. The eagle at the top of the seal caught the fluorescent light and held it. The name in the identification field, printed in clean government type, was Diana Reeves. The title below the name read, Circuit Court Judge, United States Court of Appeals, 7th Circuit. The photograph was current. The official seal at the bottom was embossed, not printed. She held it level with Brett Dawson's eyes. He read it. She watched him read it. She watched the specific progression of a man reading something that is dismantling the structure of his own certainty, the way his eyes moved across the text, and then stopped, and then moved back to the beginning, and then stopped again. The pen in his left hand stopped moving. His mouth, which had been slightly open in preparation for something closed. The report form tilted in his grip as his hand processed the signal from his brain that said in whatever language the brain uses for such signals, everything you have been writing for the last 45 minutes is now a document that will be used against you. The color changed in his face. Not all at once, it was a gradual process, almost like watching a tide going out. The flush of his skin moved toward gray and then toward something paler than gray, and she watched it happen with the stillness of someone who has waited for something long enough to no longer need to react when it arrives. No one in the room spoke. The fluorescent light hummed above them. The radio at the desk said something that no one processed. Outside, a car horn, and then nothing. 5 seconds passed. Diana lowered the credentials wallet. "I told you 4 times, she said. Her voice was quiet. The specific quiet of a person who has nothing to prove by raising it. "I told you before you struck me. I told you on the ground. I told you in the vehicle. I told you during processing. 4 times, and you chose not to hear it." She paused. "You made choices today, Officer Dawson. You made several of them. Choices have consequences. I need you to understand that as clearly as I understood the order you gave me on that sidewalk." She held his gaze for a moment longer. He did not speak. His mouth worked once like a word had started and found no way forward. She looked away from him, which was itself a statement, and walked toward Marcus Webb. "Let's go," she said. Behind her, she heard the report form hit the floor. She did not turn around. Outside, in the white afternoon light of the precinct parking lot, she stopped for a moment beside an unmarked FBI vehicle. Marcus was 2 steps behind her, giving her the space she needed without being asked. She stood still. She looked at nothing in particular. The chain-link fence at the far edge of the lot, the rectangle of blue sky above the building line, the ordinary geography of a city that had continued its afternoon without interruption. Her right hand moved involuntarily to her left wrist, the bandaged one. She felt the pressure of the wrap, the dull ache beneath it, the specific reality of an injury sustained on a public sidewalk while she was doing nothing more than walking to her car. For one moment, not long, perhaps 4 seconds, her hand shook. A very small tremor, the kind the body produces not from weakness, but from the delayed processing of shock, from the gap between what the mind has controlled and what the body has been quietly carrying all morning. She let it shake. She did not try to stop it. She watched it with the same clinical observation she brought to everything, and then after those 4 seconds, it stopped. She exhaled. She dropped her hand. She walked to the car. In the parking structure on Meridian Way, 2 blocks from where Diana had intended to go when this morning began, Marcus Webb stood beside his car and delivered his briefing in the methodical, complete fashion that she remembered from his days in her chambers when he had presented case research with the same quality of thoroughness. He covered the visible evidence first, then the less visible, and then the evidence that was not yet visible, but that he knew existed. "The live stream is at 2.1 million views as of 30 minutes ago, he said. "It's been picked up by CNN, MSNBC, the AP Wire. Your identity has been confirmed publicly by 3 sources, including a colleague from the circuit who recognized you on screen and spoke to a reporter before I could reach her." He paused. "The statement is already out." Diana nodded. She had expected this. The body cameras. That's the second thing. Webb pulled out his tablet. I spoke to a young officer named Jason Park on my way out of the building. He came to me, approached me in the hallway before I left. His body camera was running throughout the arrest. Audio quality is confirmed. I listened to a 30-second clip on his camera. You can hear you identifying yourself all 4 times. Clearly, with no response from the officers present that acknowledges the statement. He looked at her. He's volunteering the footage, voluntarily, his own initiative. Diana absorbed this. She thought about Jason Park in the hallway, the young officer who had been standing very still. She filed him under a category that she had in 26 years labeled internally as the category of people who make the system occasionally worth believing, in people who do the right thing, not because the consequences favor it, but because they have not yet been fully trained out of knowing what the right thing is. Torres, she said. Torres copied the intake log, the processing record, and the denial of your phone call before I arrived, time-stamped. She came to me as I was leaving, handed me a USB drive, and said, quote, I don't know if this helps, but I know what I saw. She's prepared to provide a full sworn statement. She'll need protection. I know, I've already made the call. She's covered. Diana looked out across the parking structure at the city beyond it. From this elevation, she could see the northern edge of the plaza, where the protest was still continuing, its sound reaching her as a collective murmur from 3 blocks away. She could see the mounted unit's staging area empty. Now she had been told the unit had been recalled from the field within minutes of the FBI's arrival at Precinct 7. A recall that had been ordered not by Holt, but by the deputy commissioner directly over Holt's radio. She thought about what the intake log and Torres's statement and Jason Park's body camera footage meant in combination with the live stream. She thought about it the way she thought about evidence, not emotionally, but architecturally. What it proved, what it foreclosed, what structures it made possible, and what structures it made untenable. It made the she was combative narrative untenable. It made minimal necessary force untenable. It made claims about her identity that were not verifiable untenable. It made Holt's conference room briefing, which she did not yet know about in detail but whose existence she had deduced from the quality of Dawson's confidence when she had first arrived at the precinct, it made all of it untenable. What it made possible was a federal case, and not a narrow one. She turned back to Marcus. What do you need from me? Statement today, if you can manage it. Medical documentation of the shoulder and wrist, and... He paused. Diana, you don't need to ask what I need. I know what this is. I know what you're going to do. I just need you to let me run the investigation properly, so that when this goes to a federal court, it is bulletproof. She looked at him for a moment. You were the best clerk I ever had, she said. I know, he said. She saw the edge of a smile, brief and controlled. I learned from the best. Dawson had stood over her. He had the badge, the horse, the authority, and she had stayed quiet and built the case. Some people say she should have fought back harder in the moment. Others say her composure was the most powerful thing she could have done. What do you think is staying calm, the right call when the system is failing you in real time? Leave your answer below. And if you want to see more stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. We're releasing new ones every week. The complaint was filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office at 3:47 p.m. on the same day as the arrest. It was not a complaint that had taken long to assemble. This was because the evidence was not ambiguous and the law was not complicated. What Dawson had done fell cleanly under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law, a statute that Diana Reeves had cited in her own rulings 37 times over 11 years. What Holt had done in the conference room, assembling a coordinated false narrative with the officers present, fell under obstruction of justice and conspiracy to obstruct a civil rights investigation. The complaint named 4 defendants, Dawson, Holt, Paulson, and Ferraro. Kinsella, the union representative, was named separately in a parallel proceeding that would take 6 weeks to unspool and would eventually reveal that union funds intended for officer legal support had over a period of years been partially redirected toward informal payments to supervisory staff who had dismissed internal affairs complaints, including specifically the 3 complaints against Dawson filed in 2019, 2021, and 2023. Diana was not the prosecutor on this case. She was the victim. She understood completely that this required a different set of behaviors than those she was accustomed to. She was accustomed to the bench, to the position of deciding, and now she was required to occupy the position of the person on whose behalf decisions were made. She found this adjustment less difficult than she had expected because the system was doing what the system was supposed to do, and her faith in the system, not blind faith, not faith independent of evidence, but the professional faith of a person who had spent decades working inside it, was being in this particular instance borne out. She gave her statement at 4:30 p.m. It was detailed, precise, and entirely consistent with every piece of physical and documentary evidence. This was not because she had engineered it to be consistent. It was consistent because it was true, and she told the truth the way she always told it, without decoration, without emotional amplification, without any element that could be attacked on cross. When the U.S. Attorney's team had finished their questions, one of the younger attorneys looked up from her notes and said with a slight involuntary quality to her voice, "Judge Reeves, you were incredibly composed throughout this. Most people don't have 26 years of evidence training," Diana said. "I knew what I was building the moment I hit the ground." Dawson's attorney filed for dismissal on the first of the 14 grounds that would ultimately be rejected by the court in a ruling that Diana would later describe in a rare moment of dry humor to Marcus Webb as thorough. After the dismissal motion failed, Dawson's attorney approached the U.S. Attorney's office with a plea offer. Dawson would plead to a misdemeanor time served. He had been in custody for 12 hours following arrest and submit to mandatory retraining. The U.S. Attorney's Office declined. When told of this, Diana said nothing. It was not her call to make. She had told Marcus in the parking structure on the day of the arrest that she trusted his process. She had meant it. She trusted the process the way she trusted anything, not reflexively, not sentimentally, but because she had examined the evidence and reached a conclusion. Holt, facing the obstruction count, accepted a plea deal within 3 weeks. He resigned from the department, forfeited his pension accrual for the years during which the covered-up complaints had occurred, and agreed to cooperate fully with the broader investigation into the union fund misappropriation. He would serve 2 years of supervised release. This was not the sentence Diana would have imposed, but it was not her sentence to impose, and the information that Holt's cooperation produced led to consequences that were, in her assessment, more significant than any sentence Holt might have received. Dawson went to trial. The federal courthouse was 40 years old and built in the style of federal architecture that communicated permanence through weight, heavy stone, deep-set windows, the kind of facade that is designed to make you feel that what happens inside it has consequence. Diana had walked into this building hundreds of times as a judge, through the secured entrance, up the judge's elevator, into the controlled space of her own courtroom. On the morning of Dawson's trial, she walked in through the public entrance, through the security line, up the wide marble stairs with the general public, and took a seat in the gallery. She sat in the third row from the front to the left of the aisle. She was not the presiding judge. That was Judge Patricia Marano, a woman Diana knew and respected, and who had been scrupulously careful to ensure that no element of the case was handled by anyone who could reasonably be accused of closeness to Diana. The jury had been impaneled cleanly. The evidence was in order. The trial was expected to last 4 days. It lasted 3. Deja Brooks took the stand on day 1. She was, by this point, no longer just a journalism student. She had been published in 3 national outlets based on her coverage of the arrest and its aftermath, and she had been offered and accepted a staff position at a digital news organization. She testified about what she had seen and what she had filmed, and the clip was played for the jury. And the jury watched a black woman in a gray blazer tell a mounted officer 4 times that she was a federal judge, and watched the officer respond to this by continuing forward, and watched her go to the ground, and watched her be cuffed. The clip ran for 6 minutes. For those 6 minutes, the courtroom was completely silent. Kim Torres testified on the day 2. Her testimony covered the intake process, the charges entered the timeline, the 42-minute delay in providing Diana with phone access. She testified about the contents of the intake log. She was composed, clear, and unshaken by the defense's cross-examination, which tried to characterize her actions in copying and preserving the intake records as unauthorized and potentially criminal. Torres had anticipated this. She answered each question precisely without elaboration, and the transcript of her testimony would later be cited by 2 journalism schools as a model of how to provide factual testimony under hostile questioning. Jason Park testified on day 2 as well in the afternoon session. He was 26 years old and visibly nervous, and he testified with the specific quality of a person who is very clear about what they saw, and slightly unclear about whether saying so will be acceptable to the people around them. He answered the questions. He confirmed the body camera footage. He confirmed that the audio was accurate. Under cross-examination, when asked whether he understood that his testimony could harm his colleagues, he paused for a moment and said, "I understood that not testifying would mean letting something unjust go on record as something else. I didn't think that was right." Judge Morano gave no visible reaction to this statement. Diana in the gallery did not react visibly either, but she filed it in the category labeled "People Who Make the System Worth Believing in." The jury deliberated for 8 hours. It was the kind of deliberation time that indicated not difficulty, but thoroughness. The jury going through each count, each piece of evidence, each element of the law, not because they were uncertain, but because they wanted the record to be complete. The foreman delivered the verdict in the still of a Tuesday afternoon in a courtroom that had been quietly full since morning, with people who had no formal role in the proceedings and who had simply come to be present for whatever happened. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, assault guilty. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, unlawful arrest, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to produce false incident reports, guilty. Brett Dawson received a sentence of 9 years in federal prison. He would be required to serve at least 7 before becoming eligible for parole review. His pension was forfeited. His certification as a peace officer was revoked permanently in all jurisdictions. Diana did not look at him when the sentence was read. She looked at the family seated in the front row to her left, a woman of about 50, a man of about the same age, a young woman who looked to be in her 20s. They were Marcus Green's mother, his stepfather, and his sister. They had been at the trial every day. They had said nothing publicly, given no statement to the press, attended every session, and left every session in silence. When the verdict was read, Marcus Green's mother closed her eyes for a long moment and then opened them and turned to look at Diana. And Diana looked back at her, and something passed between them that did not require words. When Diana walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon light, she was surrounded briefly by the crowd that had gathered on the steps. She said nothing to the press. She walked down the steps and turned east toward the parking structure, and she walked the way she always walked. That jury took 8 hours, not because they were unsure, but because they wanted every detail on record. Think about what that means. Every person in that room understood the weight of what they were deciding. If you were on that jury, knowing everything you know now, what would your verdict have been? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe accountability matters, if you want more stories like this one, reaching more people, share this video with someone who needs to see it. There is something that happens in a federal courtroom when a guilty verdict is delivered on a charge involving an officer of the law. It is not the same as other verdicts. Other verdicts in fraud cases, in drug cases, in the long taxonomy of crime that fills a court's annual docket, arrive into a room that holds them with a professional equanimity. The equanimity of a system that has processed this outcome before and will process it again. A guilty verdict in an officer misconduct case arrives differently. It arrives into a room that is held for the duration of the trial, a specific and unresolved tension. The tension between 2 competing ideas about what the institution of law enforcement is and what it is for and what happens to that institution when it is used by specific people in specific ways for reasons that have nothing to do with the safety of the public. The tension does not resolve with the verdict. It redistributes. In the gallery, people absorbed the verdict in different ways. The reporters wrote. The legal observers noted. The attorneys for both sides organized their papers with the practiced composure of people who have been in this position before and understand that the verdict is a point in a process rather than the end of the process. In the back of the gallery, 2 officers from a district 2 cities over who had driven to attend off-duty in civilian clothes for reasons they had not shared with their department sat very still and said nothing to each other for a long time. And in the third row from the front, Marcus Green's family received the verdict in the way that people receive something they have been waiting for without being fully able to believe it would come. His mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, and when the foreman said guilty for the third time, and the courtroom absorbed the echo of it, she did not make a sound. She breathed. She was quiet in the way that grief and relief arriving together produce a specific kind of silence, not the silence of nothing, but the silence of so much that it cannot be spoken. Diana looked at her from across the aisle. She thought about this grocery bag, the one that had been scattered around Marcus Green on the pavement 47 feet from his apartment building. She had read in the public reports that he had been carrying milk and a box of cereal and a bag of apples. She had filed this detail in a particular place in her memory, the place where specific concrete irreducible details of injustice are stored, not because they are legally relevant, but because they are humanly necessary to retain. Because the moment the thing becomes abstract, the moment it becomes a data point or a policy discussion or a systemic pattern, is the moment it loses the weight that makes it true. Marcus Green had been carrying apples. He had been 22 years old, and he had been carrying apples, and he was not here. And the verdict in this courtroom would not bring him back. And Diana knew this, and Marcus Green's mother knew this, and the system that had just delivered this verdict knew this. And none of this made the verdict meaningless. What it made the verdict was necessary. A necessary, insufficient, partial, hard-won response to something that should never have required a response. A data point in a series of data points that might accumulated over decades and over decisions made by people in rooms like this one, add up to something that resembled change. She believed this, not because she needed to believe it, not as a comfort, as a professional assessment based on the evidence. She believed it because Kim Torres was sitting 3 rows behind her, because Jason Park had driven himself here on his day off and was sitting in the last row near the door, because Deja Brooks was in the press section with her recorder and her notebook and the particular focused attention of a person who has understood in the last several months what her work is for. Because the room was full of people who had come not for theater, but for record, the act of bearing witness, which is, Diana had always believed, the foundational act of a society that takes its own laws seriously. She stood when the judge adjourned the session. She did not speak to the press on the courthouse steps, and she had told Marcus Webb that she would not, and he had agreed, and they had understood each other completely on this point, as on most points. What she had to say was in the record. The record was public. Anyone who wanted to know what she had to say could read it. She walked. The consequences moved in expanding rings from the center, the way consequences always do when the stone that falls is large enough. The mounted unit was the first to go. Within 72 hours of the verdict, the deputy commissioner, who had been preparing the paperwork since the evening of the arrest, issued the dissolution order. It was announced in a press release that deployed the bureaucratic language of reform, operational reassessment, resource reallocation, alignment with community policing priorities. None of these phrases appeared in the original order, which used simpler language. The horses were transferred to a county agricultural program. The equipment was inventoried. The unit that had existed for 31 years was gone in 72 hours, and the absence of any public ceremony marking its end was itself a statement. The consent decree came 6 weeks later. The Department of Justice had been building its file on Creston Heights PD for 7 months before Diana's arrest gave the case the dimension of documented evidence it had been lacking. Evidence that was not statistical or anecdotal, but video-audio, time-stamped, witnessed, impossible to characterize as anything other than what it was. The settlement placed the department under federal oversight for 5 years. Use of force protocols, body camera requirements, a civilian oversight board with independent subpoena power. 94 pages of binding accountability for an institution that had for years operated on the assumption that accountability applied to everyone except itself. The third consequence was the one nobody had anticipated because it required Holt to talk, and nobody had expected Holt to talk. But Holt facing obstruction charges with no institutional support and a union that had already begun distancing itself from him made the calculation that cooperation was survival. And he was right. And what he provided in exchange for his reduced sentence was a complaint database spanning 8 years and 3 precincts. A paper trail of buried use-of-force reports, dismissed, complaints, and the informal payment structure that had kept misconduct invisible for nearly a decade. The FBI investigation that followed ran for 18 months and resulted in 7 officer indictments and 4 supervisory charges across the department. Ed Kinsella, the union representative who had sat in Holt's conference room and chewed his gum and called the video a problem that would burn out in a news cycle, was convicted of misappropriation of union funds and conspiracy to obstruct civil rights investigations. He was sentenced to 4 years and ordered to repay the union treasury the full amount of misappropriated funds, which totaled $312,000 and change. The union elected a new leadership body that issued a public statement acknowledging the organization's failures of accountability and integrity, and committing to a reform process overseen by an independent monitor. Torres was not punished. This was notable because there had been, in the weeks following Dawson's arrest, a significant amount of institutional pressure applied toward characterizing her preservation of the intake records as unauthorized. The pressure had been applied informally through supervisory channels by people who understood that their own positions depended on the narrative that what Torres had done was a violation rather than an act of institutional integrity. The U.S. Attorney's Office had moved swiftly to communicate clearly in writing with copies to the department's legal counsel that any retaliatory action against Torres would constitute obstruction of the federal investigation and would be treated accordingly. The pressure stopped. Torres was transferred at her request to the Internal Affairs Division, where she was promoted within 14 months to the rank of detective. Jason Park remained on the force. He was not formally commended. The politics of formal commendation within the department were still too fraught, the aftershocks of the investigation still too active. He was, however, assigned a mentor in the person of a 20-year veteran who had been clean throughout the investigation, and he continued to work, and he was regarded by the colleagues who knew the full story with the quiet respect that is given to people who do the right thing at personal cost. Deja Brooks received the Society of Professional Journalists' Ethics in Journalism Award for her coverage of the Creston Heights Police Department in the 14 months following Diana's arrest. She completed her master's thesis, which was titled The Documentation Gap, Citizen Video Evidence, and the Accountability Architecture of Police Misconduct. It was published by an academic press. It was later cited in testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Police Reform. She walked to the courthouse on the Monday after the verdict. Not because she needed to. She could have taken her car as she had taken it for 11 years, parking in the reserved judicial space in the secured structure on the building's north side. She walked because she had walked on the morning of her arrest, and because she had made a decision during the 42 minutes she spent in the holding room at Precinct 7 that she would not let that morning redefine her relationship to public space. The city's sidewalks had been public space before she was born, and they would be public space after she was gone, and she declined to code them differently in her own internal geography based on what had happened to her on one particular corner on one particular Tuesday in June. She walked Oak Street. She passed the spot. She did not stop or slow. She noted the location with the same flat professional acknowledgement she applied to anything she filed and set aside. There was no marker there, nothing to indicate that anything had occurred at this spot, which was as it should be. A thing's significance is not located in the geography of where it happened. It lives in the record. She entered the courthouse through the West Corridor, the public entrance, as she had done on the day of Dawson's trial and on the 3 days that followed. She moved through security with the familiarity of someone who has gone through a security checkpoint every morning for over a decade. She took the public stairs rather than the judicial elevator. Not because she was performing anything, there was no one watching, no one to perform for, but because she was a person who had spent 2 weeks reconstructing herself after a significant event, and reconstruction sometimes looked like using the stairs. Her chambers were as she had left them on the morning of the arrest. Her clerk had maintained the docket. Her assistant had handled the messages. Her The room had the familiar smell of old paper and the specific dry air conditioning of the court building, and it looked the way it always looked. Books on 3 walls, desk in the center, with the surface clear except for the docket folder. The window on the east side, letting in the morning light in a way that made the room look for an hour each morning like a still life. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the desk on the familiar wood surface that she had touched every working day for 11 years, and she felt its specific texture and temperature and let that register. The shoulder had healed, not perfectly. A doctor had told her there would be some residual stiffness in the rotator cuff for a few months, but functionally. She had full range of motion. The wrist was fine. She looked out the east window. From this angle, she could see, if she leaned slightly, the northern edge of Oak Street, the edge of the plaza where the protest had been. Today, it was empty, just ordinary city space, people moving, the morning commerce of a Tuesday. She thought about the woman on the fire escape, Deja Brooks, who had filmed with 22 minutes of footage before the moment that changed everything. She thought about Torres handing over the USB drive with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is ready to live with it. She thought about Jason Park standing still in the hallway, waiting for the right moment to announce the thing he had already decided. And she thought about the person who was not her, who had no credentials wallet in her bag, who had no law clerk turned FBI agent 10 minutes away, who had said, "I am a federal judge," 4 times and been ignored. What would have happened to that person? She knew the answer. She had always known the answer. She had known it in the holding room in the parking structure during the trial, and she knew it now. The answer was that it would have been processed as a system processes things that it does not want to be visible quietly, with efficiency, in the direction of outcomes that protect the institution. The charges might have been reduced before trial. A plea might have been offered. The video might have burned through the news cycle and been replaced by the next thing. And the person who was not Diana Reeves, who was just a black woman in a gray blazer walking to her car on a Tuesday morning, would have carried what happened as weight as cost as the specific tax that the experience of moving through the world ihajist in a black body in America levies on those who move through it. Diana knew this. She had known it before the morning of the arrest, and the morning of the arrest had given her a body-level knowledge of it that was different in texture from the intellectual knowledge she had held before. She had been in the system inside it, both as the person it was supposed to protect and as the person it had treated as something else, and the experience had not shaken her faith in the system, but it had clarified with the specificity of personal evidence exactly where that faith was warranted and exactly where it needed to be fought for. She opened the docket folder. The first case was a motion to reconsider sentencing in a civil rights case, an inmate who had been held in solitary for 14 months past the approved limit, whose attorney argued that the continued confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment. It was not a new argument. The law on the question was settled in several respects and contested in others. She had read the briefs. She knew where the argument was strong and where it was not. Her clerk knocked twice on the open door. "Attorneys are in the anteroom, Judge." 5 minutes, she said. She looked at the case file. She thought about the man whose name was on it, a man she had never met who was sitting in a 6x8 cell somewhere in the federal system, waiting for someone to read his case and say whether the thing that had been done to him was legal or not. She thought about the weight of that waiting, which she understood in a small way from 42 minutes in a holding room and which he had been carrying for 14 months. She made a note in the margin. Then she stood, put on her robe, and went to court. She walked home just after 6 o'clock. The evening was cooler than the day of the arrest, had been the kind of late June evening that sometimes arrives without warning, carried on a wind from the north, giving the city a reprieve it didn't know to expect. The pavement was still warm from the day, but the air above it had changed quality, had become the kind of air that makes you take a slightly deeper breath. She turned onto Oak Street. At the corner of Oak and 5th, the corner she had turned on the morning of the arrest, heading toward Meridian Roasters. Heading for the morning she had not known was coming. There was a mural. It had appeared within 2 weeks of the verdict, painted on the exterior wall of the vintage camera shop in shades of gray and blue and deep ochre, large enough to be visible from across the street. It showed a woman in a gray blazer, mid-step face, set chin level, carrying a coffee cup. The image was not heroic in the conventional sense. There was no cape, no symbol, no triumphal gesture. It was the specific image of a person moving through the world with the full knowledge of what that world was and the full refusal to be diminished by it. It was recognizable, but not literal, a composite of specificity and archetype. Diana looked at it. She stood on the sidewalk for perhaps 20 seconds longer than she had intended to, looking at the image on the wall of the camera shop. She noted the quality of the painting, someone who knew what they were doing, who had made careful decisions about light and angle, and the specific expression of the subject's face, which was not angry, not triumphant, not performing, but simply present, fully present in the way of someone who knows that what happens next is a matter of choice. She turned away and continued walking. 2 blocks from her building, a woman she did not know stepped beside her at a crosswalk. They waited for the light. The woman glanced at her sideways, recognized something in her profile, and then looked forward again and said quietly, simply, "Thank you." Diana looked at her. The woman was perhaps 40 in work clothes, a bag over her shoulder, waiting for the light. She did not appear to want anything more than she had said. The light changed. She crossed. Diana watched her go. She thought, there are women in this city for whom I could not do what Torres did and what Park did. There are women who stood on that sidewalk and were not me and carried something home from it that they are still carrying, and the system that failed them is not fixed. The consent decree is in motion. The mounted unit is gone. Dawson is in prison. Kinsella is in prison. But the other precincts are still there. The other officers trained in other Holtz offices are still working. The records of dismissed complaints are being reviewed in 2 cities and not reviewed in 20 others. She was not done. That was the truth of it. She was not done. She entered her building. She took the elevator. She set down her bag, took off her robe. She had worn at home, an unusual choice, but she had worn it without thinking, or perhaps not without thinking. Perhaps with the very specific thought that it was hers and that she was going to wear it wherever she chose, and she sat at her desk. She pulled out a legal pad. She began to write. Not a motion, not a ruling, not a judicial opinion. A proposal, a framework for a judicial conference on accountability review mechanisms for use of force complaints in federal jurisdictions. It was not something she had to write. It was not something that anyone had asked her to write. It was something that the system needed, and she was in a position to write it, and she was going to write it because that was what the morning of the arrest had told her, in the clearest possible language, that the law, when it works, works because people inside it decide to make it work. And that decision, unlike the one that Brett Dawson had made on a Tuesday morning in June, was one she had no intention of reversing. She wrote in long, sure strokes across the page. The city moved outside her window. She kept writing. Justice, when it comes, does not always arrive the way we imagine it will. It does not always arrive with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives in the testimony of a 26-year-old officer who understood that silence would be a choice. Sometimes it arrives in the hands of a desk officer who copied a file onto a USB drive and put it in her jacket pocket. Sometimes it arrives via the lens of a journalism student on a fire escape who kept filming because something in her gut told her to. And sometimes it arrives in the form of a woman who was knocked to the ground on a public sidewalk and who lay there for a moment in the specific heat of June concrete, and who decided in that moment that what happened next would be decided not by the officer above her, but by the record she was already building. Diana Reeves did not survive that morning because she was a federal judge. She survived it with her power intact because she understood that the law she had dedicated her life to was not a shield that protected her. It was a weapon that she knew how to use. And she used it. For herself, yes, but also for everyone who would come after her, on sidewalks in other cities in similar moments, without the credentials in their bag. This story is for them. If this story moved you, if you believe that accountability matters, that documentation matters, that the people who do the right thing in difficult moments deserve to be seen, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to our channel for more stories where justice finds its way home. And drop a comment below. Who in this story do you think showed the most courage? Was it Diana Torres Park? Deja Brooks? Tell us your answer. Thank you for watching this one with us. The stories that matter most are the ones that remind us what the system is for and what it costs when we let it become something else. You chose to spend this time with us, and that means something. We'll see you in the next one.